So thanks for coming out and thanks for taking the time to hear about what's going on the other side of the world and for caring enough. So what's the biggest problem in Israel and Palestine? So many, but really the problems are not so different than right here, right now. It's still the 1% exploiting the 99%. I'm going to show you just a partial list of some of the top Israeli officials who in the last few years have been either alleged or investigated or charged or convicted of major corruption, graft, and taking bribes. So this mayor, 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 and this mayor. I'm not finished. This member of Knesset, this member of Knesset, this member of Knesset, this, and this member of Knesset. It's still going. It's this minister, this minister, this minister, this, and this minister. And it's still going. It's this chief rabbi, this chief rabbi, this chief rabbi, this chief rabbi's son, this top rabbi, this top rabbi. And the list goes on, and this prime minister, this prime minister, this prime minister. That's all the prime ministers that have been in power since I've been living in the country. The only one that's off this list is someone who's dead now. If he wasn't, he would also be on this list. And there's another major corruption scandal going on as we speak. I can't talk about it because there's a publication ban on it. So with this incredibly long list, why aren't people up in arms? Why aren't people throwing out the bums, so to speak? Well, it happens everywhere. It's a classic divide and conquer strategy, but it's especially effective in Israel. So instead of focusing on the real issues, the people's anger is diverted to the ethnic outliers, the minorities, the indigenous Palestinians, the African refugees. So I'm going to take you through the last 5 years of my reporting, give you a sense of what that's like on the ground. Shmuel Eliyahu, he's the chief rabbi of the holy city of Tzfat. And in 2010, he organizes hundreds of chief rabbis in the country to issue an edict that forbids Jewish people from selling or even renting apartments to non-Jews. And again, this isn't some random dude. I personally believe in freedom of speech. Everyone should be able to say whatever they want, no matter how racist it is. That's my opinion. But it's not just what he says. This is someone who is paid by my tax money, and frankly, your tax money too. So he forbids Jews from renting apartments to non-Jews, and then outlines the reason why. He says, because it causes the public to commit the sin of mixed marriages. So what does this mean? It means that he is afraid that if Jewish people and non-Jewish people live on the same street, that there is a possibility that their children will meet and flirt and fall in love and decide to spend their lives together. And that is what he is willing at all costs to prevent, to the point of instructing people to make their neighborhoods Gentile free. So again, not some random dude, but someone who's very highly respected. He was the Jewish Home Party's candidate for chief rabbi of Jerusalem. Another top rabbi in the country, also a state sponsored, Yitzchak Shapira, author of the King's Torah, and he puts out similarly another publication, but he intends it for soldiers, and he writes there, while you are in the army, there is a war going on at home. If someone tempts Jewish women, figure out for yourself what is the most correct thing to do. In other words, if you see on the street Jewish women and non-Jewish men talking to one another, bust that up. And I can't tell you outright to get physical, but hint, hint, you wink, wink, you know what to do. So we continue, and we have, this is probably familiar to some of you because everywhere that Jewish people live, everywhere in the world, there are kosher restaurants. There's a kosher bureaucracy, essentially rabbis who will inspect Jewish restaurants to ensure that they follow the rules of kashrut, of keeping kosher, for those people who follow the religious rules of how food should be prepared. So this exists also in Israel, the chief rabbinate of Tel Aviv-Yafo, and this is an example of a kosher certificate granted to a restaurant after being approved. Yes, you follow the kosher rules. Yes, you are hereby acknowledged to be a kosher restaurant. Well, we have the formation of a group in Israel called Lehava, and they start issuing kosher certificates of their own, but not the same exact type. Again, I've translated it for you into English so you can understand what's going on. This is Lehava, preventing intermarriage. This certificates that the owner of this business employs Jewish workers and doesn't employ enemies. In other words, they'll walk into your business, they'll inspect it. Only Jews working here? Okay, so you get a passing grade. And if in fact the store owner is proud of this fact, if he wants to advertise it and let people know, yes, only Jews work here, we refuse to employ non-Jews, then they will display it in the front of their store, hoping to gain more business by appealing to other racists in this way. And this is the head of the Lehava organization, Bentzi Gopstein. Now you'd think someone like this is so obviously racist, promoting racism, that he would be beyond the pale of the political discourse. I can hardly imagine an American politician embracing him. But in fact, that's what happens in Israel. Instead of being pushed to the margins, he's brought into the very Knesset itself, brought in as an expert witness to speak on how Jewish women are suffering a plague of being kidnapped by non-Jews. And of course, police officers who attend the Knesset meeting say, we have no idea what they're talking about. We don't even have one example of this on record. But they are pushing this idea that non-Jews are scouring the country trying to kidnap and capture Jewish women. So they operate a website, and on their website they have the page of disgrace, where they list, women, Jewish women who date non-Jews, to try to name and shame them, to humiliate them. These women should be ashamed of themselves, they write on the page. If you go to the site, you'll see prominently featured Einat Wilf. Now, Einat was actually, until a couple years ago, a member of Knesset. All right? And the reason that she was on the list is because her husband, her life partner, is not Jewish. He's this man, the German journalist Richard Gutjahr. And they met, interestingly, on one of these coexistence programs, just as Israeli and Palestinian youth are brought sometimes to some other place in the world so they can meet each other without the excess baggage of the tension of the conflict and just get to know each other as human beings and to try to diffuse that tension. In the same way, Jews and Germans are also brought together for conferences, the hope that they will get over the sordid past of the last century. And sure enough, at one of these conferences, Einat met Richard and fell in love, and they decided to spend their lives together and start a family. So for that act of for being a race traitor, she is put up on this page as to try to shame her. And we see, 2011, we see the beginnings of racist rallies, or an uptick in racist rallies, or anti-miscegenation rallies. It's a word that you probably haven't even heard in your lifetime, but this is what's happening. You have, even in some cases, deputy mayors of town organizing this anti-miscegenation rally, where you have people marching through town with signs, Jewish women for the Jewish people, okay, like all your vaginas belong to us, or something. And you can see some of these are just kids, preteens in some cases. This is the messaging that even the youth are being exposed to and drafted into. And you have also gangs, street gangs essentially, that patrol city streets in Israel. They'll wear they'll all wear the same shirt with a similar logo, and the idea is that they are, scouring the streets, trying to find any examples of Jews and non-Jews, interacting socially, and to break it up, harass and harangue them until, the mood is ruined and everyone kind of goes their own way. But for some people, it's not even just harassing and haranguing. It's full-on beating, putting people in the hospital or the morgue. It's straight up people who, mask up and run through the streets, and if they find any Palestinians that they even suspect of thinking perhaps maybe I might forget it. The classic example of this is actually discussed in that short film I showed earlier. This man, Jamal Julani, a young Palestinian man walking in downtown Jerusalem, and just minding his own business, a group of young Israeli Jews, jump on him and they're just looking for someone to attack, because in their mind, any Palestinian they see in downtown Jerusalem is seeking out Jewish women. So they jump on him, and they beat him, and they actually kill him. Now paramedics come to the scene, and they're resuscitating him. While they're doing this, the perpetrators are just standing around, and they're like, "What are you even trying to resuscitate him for? What do you care? He's an Arab." And eventually they keep going, and they resuscitate him, they bring him back, and they bring him to the hospital, as you see. And the crazy part is that they actually admitted this. They weren't ashamed of it. They were proud of it. So they tell the police, yeah, straight up, yeah, we beat him because he's Palestinian. We don't want him, hanging around where Jewish women are. And even though they have this confession on tape, the police claim to lose the confession. So as a result, they get off with just a slap on the wrist, 2, 3, 4 months, something like that. And this is the prevailing atmosphere in the country, on the streets. And just a few days later, if you can imagine, that same group, Lehava, they go back to that location, Zion Square, Kikar Tzion, if any of you are familiar with downtown Jerusalem, and they hand out these handbills that you see here, in handwritten Arabic, and again, I've translated it for your benefit. "We are not willing to let an Arab go out with a girl from our nation." All right? Last week, an Arab who thought he could find Jewish girls got hurt. So they're straight up saying, "Don't even come around here. You will get your ass beat." And I mean, you would think that after this lynching or near lynching that people would kind of take a step back. But no, full speed ahead. And this is the prevailing atmosphere. Now here's another example. This is Mai. She would have described herself as a very typical Jewish Israeli woman. Nothing out of the ordinary about her. She met this man, Gabriel, in Israel. He's from Sudan, an African refugee. I'm going to talk a little bit later about African refugees in Israel, but just for now, all you need to know is they met and fell in love and decided they wanted to spend their lives together. And one weekend they went down to the tourist town of Eilat on the Red Sea so they could have some time off, a little bit of vacation. And sure enough, they post a photo to Facebook, and now this group Lehava is not only rampaging through the streets, but they're also scouring the internet for any evidence of race mixing. And so they find this photograph, and then they put it on their on their forums, on their racist forums, and they write, "We don't have enough Muhammads and Ahmeds of our own. Now the Sudanese are taking our women too." And here's another classic example. So this took place this past summer. This is Mahmoud. He's the son of Muslim citizens of Israel. And this is Moral. She's the daughter of Jewish citizens of Israel. Now, they met in Jaffa, and they fell in love and decided to spend their lives together. What could be better? Well, unfortunately, on the day of their wedding, instead of getting ready and maybe having a bachelor party or getting psyched up with their friends, Mahmoud had to go to court because Bentzi Gupstein of Lehava somehow he got a hold of their wedding invitation, and he distributed it on their racist Facebook group and invited all his racist followers to come out and protest their wedding, if you can imagine that. And so Mahmoud goes to court to try to stop this from happening, and he appeals to the judge. Judge isn't having it. The protest goes on as planned, and sure enough, on the day of their wedding, outside their wedding hall, you have hundreds of Israelis screaming, "Death to the Arabs, Mavet la'Aravim." And here's a photograph from the event. You see this sign in the background, Hitbolelut hi shoah la'am ha'yehudi, which means, again, I've translated it, intermarriage is a holocaust for the Jewish people. Okay, now get what this is. He's saying that two people deciding they want to spend their lives together, what could be more beautiful than that, right? Is the Holocaust, is genocide. Okay? Now, what's twice as psycho is that you have people at the event screaming, "This is the Holocaust," and at the same time, the spokesperson for the group is telling the Israeli newspaper Ma'ariv, on that very day, he says, "Hitler was right, but about the wrong nation. We are the chosen race." It's like, I don't even know what to say. And you would think after this that it would just be plain as day, that anyone with two eyes and two ears would understand that this group is inciting racism and is responsible for these racist attacks. But no, it comes to court, and this Israeli judge says, no, I see no connection between Lehava and these racist violent incidents occurring on city streets in Israel. So they're let off the hook, and we continue. Again, Ori, she would consider herself just a typical Jewish Israeli woman. But she met this man, Musa, and they fell in love, again, decided to spend their lives together. Now, in Israel, you can only get married if you're of the same religion. That's not by accident, it's by design. That's the whole point, to prevent people of different, religions from falling in love and spending their lives together. But it happens against all odds, and in their case, now, true enough, there are legal loopholes to get around it. If you have enough means, you can fly your whole family to Cyprus, get married there at City Hall or some other part of the world, and then come back, and then it's a fait accompli. You're already married. There's nothing you can do about it. But besides the fact that you have to have money to do that, some people can't leave the country. Like Musa is an African refugee. He can't leave the country or else he won't be allowed back in. So they can't leave the country. So what are they going to do? They can't get married. They get this, they have a simple ceremony in front of a lawyer. It doesn't count for anything legally, but at least for them, it's their way of saying to the world, we love each other, we want to spend our lives together, we got this little certificate. Great. And because the government is now in the process of rounding these African refugees into camps, into these desert detention centers, I'll talk more about that later on, but just for now, all you need to know, they're rounding African refugees into camps. Oli is like, listen, this is my husband, this is my life partner. Don't send him. There's no reason to. We live together. I have an apartment. I have a job. We have a family. This is our family. Don't separate us. Don't send him down to this camp. The government doesn't care. It rounds him up. Now, she appeals to people. She's hoping that if people understand her plight, that she's a Jewish Israeli citizen, that maybe they will be more understanding of his situation. And so she's gone to newspapers and she's gone to television channels, and there have been a couple of articles written about her story. And it's because of that she has made herself a target. Because in her efforts to appeal to people so that they can empathize with her, people now recognize her because they've seen her on TV, in the newspaper. So when she goes back, she comes once every couple of weeks, she goes down to the desert detention center to visit her partner. But when she goes back home, she's recognized on the streets of her hometown by those Lehava racist thugs, and they find her and they beat her and they kick her in the face. Okay, so this is the reality. This is Israel 2015 rather. And so it's Palestinians being attacked, it's Africans being attacked, it's the Jews who befriend them who are being attacked, and it's the places where they interact, the few places where they actually come together that are targeted. So in Israel, there are so few schools where Jews and Palestinians actually learn together, but even those few places are under attack. So here you have in Jerusalem, it's the only school of its kind in that Jerusalem area, the Hand in Hand school, and it's continually targeted by graffiti. Again, Mavet la'Aravim, death to the Arabs. And weeks later, you have people actually firebombing the place, actually taking the textbooks into the middle of the classroom and starting a big bonfire and burning the classroom. I can hardly think of something more despicable than burning a classroom where Jews and Palestinians study together. Now, if there was any question of who did this and why, it was made clear by the graffiti they left behind. Again, I've translated this into English for you. No coexistence with cancer. That's Palestinians are cancer. No miscegenation, they write. Well, at this point, firebombing a school, it's proven to be a bit of an embarrassment. Even Obama is trying to shed some light on the situation. This year for Hanukkah, for the Jewish Festival of Lights, he actually invited Jewish and Palestinian students from this hand-in-hand school to come to the White House to light the Chanukiah, the traditional candelabra that's lit in celebration of the holiday. And so they come to the White House and they're lighting the candelabra. And with this act, he puts the spotlight on this story. Otherwise, no one would have heard of it, And because with even Obama, making mention of it at this point, it's just like the Israeli police are embarrassed into action. They can't, ignore it any longer. And so, sure enough, they crack down and they find the people responsible. As you can see, no shame around it. They're smiling, they're laughing when they come to court. And when you go to their Facebook pages, you find this is the stuff they write. Death to the Arabs, we're sick of them, a Holocaust should be done to them. Now, one of their mothers was interviewed after the fact in Israeli media, and what she had to say was, if it wasn't for the law, I would have done it too. So it comes from the home. And she went on to say, Jews and Arabs learning together is disgusting. And then you wonder why there is miscegenation. And there's the connection. Now, I should point out, they were arrested for arson. They were charged with breaking and entering. All right, they were brought up on vandalism. Anything missing here? Hate crimes, perhaps? You would think something as blatant as this would deserve hate crime charges, but no. And the reason why is because in Israel, although there are hate crimes on the books, there is a legal loophole. And that's why when they were originally passed, even the founding father of Israeli fascism, Meir Kahane, even he supported this law because there's a loophole which says if you incite racism but you justify it by quoting verses from the Torah or the Talmud, if you justify the racism on religious reasons, then it's okay, it's all good. So this is what they've done, and that's why you don't hear hate crime charges. Now, when you see this photograph, this is what I see. Okay? Now, it's interesting. I'm not suggesting for a moment that there's no racism in the United States of America. Any day of the week, we can open a newspaper, we look at what's happening if it's down in Miami, or if it's in Ferguson, or if it's in your own backyard. We see this all the time, state-sponsored racism. But at least people are a little bit embarrassed about it. You kind of have to go back over half a century to see images in America of people with glee gladly advertising the fact that they are racist. But in Israel, this is our daily reality. Here, after the fact, we have this, again, chief rabbi of the city of Motzkin, and he responds by writing an op-ed talking about his local mall that's crawling with Arabs who, with their nets, they hunt poor Jewish girls day and night unceasingly. And he goes on to write, grant the Israel Prize to the group Lehava. May these righteous people be blessed. So those people who firebomb these schools, who call for a Holocaust to be perpetrated against Palestinians, they deserve the Israel Prize, the highest prize in the land. Okay, they should be blessed. This is, again, my tax money, your tax money are paying his hefty salary. So here are a few photographs of these young men and women who study at that school. In each photograph you see Jewish Israeli citizen, Palestinian citizen of Israel. Now, when you look at these photos, what do you feel? Maybe a little bit of hope that maybe it could be better? Well, that's what I feel too. But that's not what the Israeli establishment feel. It's not what the Israeli leaders feel. Ron Huldai, the mayor of Tel Aviv, does everything he can to prevent one of these schools from cropping up in his city. Yona Yahav, the mayor of Haifa, does the same. Anything he can do to prevent one of these joint Jewish-Palestinian schools from being established where both Hebrew and Arabic will be taught. Let me put it to you this way. Mount Everest, what does this have to do with anything? In all of human history, 3,500 humans have ascended to the crest of Mount Everest. Outer space, about 500 people have gone into outer space. get this, you stand a greater chance of being one of those few humans who went to the top of Mount Everest than you do of being a child born in Israel and studying with a member of the other ethnic group. You almost stand as good of a chance of being one of those few humans who went into outer space. That's how rare it is. How can we expect things to get better if this is how we're raising the next generation? So, in the United States, 1954 is when the Supreme Court, Brown versus Board of Education, officially desegregated schools. And yet, here we are, over 60 years later, and Israel still looks like this. And it's worse. It's even worse, because it isn't even confined to those borders, whatever they may be. You know about this case of Loving versus Virginia, the last time that the Supreme Court had to officially end any law that prevented people of so-called different races or religions from marrying one another. This is in the late 60s, early 70s. Well, last year, the Israeli Ministry of Education spent $4 million to prevent intermarriage, to teach Jewish children not to have romantic relationships with non-Jews. You want to hear what's worse? That wasn't even for Israeli youth. That was to teach Jewish kids outside of Israel. $4 million to teach Jewish kids outside of Israel not to have romantic relationships with non-Jews. That's my tax money, and that's your tax money. And it's not even just religious officials. I mean, it's all aspects. So here, the so-called, great white hope of liberal Zionists, Yair Lapid, the former finance minister until a couple months ago, after that wedding that went on this summer that I told you about, he says in the media, if my son came to me and said, Dad, I want you to meet Rona, not Rina, it would bother me greatly. I don't care if it bothers you greatly. Keep your racist opinions to yourself. The state has no business in the bedrooms of the nation. Okay? Now this is the secular officials. When it's the religious officials, it's like, ain't no thing, right? It's like all the way. They just go all in. So this Minister of Religious Affairs in the Israeli government, he also spoke out, and again, he reiterates this disgusting comparison that these marriages are a silent Holocaust. No shock with Eli Ben-Dahan. He's also said about Palestinians that they're beasts, not humans. And he's also said a Jew always has a much higher soul than a goy. Of course, it's only in Hebrew. You never hear about this. So I guess you're one of these goys that are supposed to just suffer with the fact that you have a lower soul. But again, the point here is that you make political points off this. Politicians reiterate these ideas because they know it translates into votes. Here in the last election cycle in Israel, here's a typical poster. You see, Rak Shas Chazaka, here I'll translate it into English again. Only a strong Shas will prevent miscegenation. A country with soul, vote Shas. This is the kind of messaging I have to see when I walk around the town that I live in. And what's even sicker is that while this is all ongoing, while those Israeli women who date non-Jewish men are vilified in the media, in the body politic. At the same time, you have groups who work with the Israeli government to use the idea of Jewish Israeli women and their supposed sexual availability to tempt you, to turn you on, so that you can be recruited for the cause of Zionism. This is how it works. They take images of conventionally attractive Jewish Israeli women. They put clothes on them that are basically elements of Israeli army uniforms, but just a little bit so that they're scantily clad, and drape ammunition across their body and have them lying in piles of weapons. And the idea is so that when you think of the Israeli army, you won't think of the damage it does. You won't think of the people who suffer on account of their actions. You'll think of these sexy women, and that maybe you might get some. And so that's supposed to make you on board for whatever the army does. So check this. On one hand, using Jewish women and their supposed sexual availability in order to convince non-Jewish people and Jewish people, but mainly it's targeted towards people outside of Israel who are mainly not Jewish. So to convince y'all to support the government, and at the same time, those Jewish Israeli women who actually have authentic romantic relationships with non-Jews, vilify them. Okay? So understand how sick it gets. This woman here on the left side, Miriam Falik, she's an American citizen. She's not an Israeli citizen. Here she is taking a photograph with the outgoing chief of staff of the Israeli army. Now, if you can imagine this, the Israeli army actually has a charity. People, I know it seems strange because you wouldn't think of an army having people making donations to the army, but in fact, there's an organization called FIDF, the Friends of the IDF, of the Israeli Defense Forces, and she is the president of this group. And so she collects money to donate. So she's the number one donator to the Israeli army. All right? That's one hand. Second hand, she's also the number one donator or funder of the group that funds Lehava, that same anti-miscegenation group. And at the same time, on the third hand, she is the number one contributor to the election campaign of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The whole trifecta. It's all 1-6 system. Do you get it? When I look at photos of my friends Basau and Tia, I'm inspired by them. I want my relationship to look like that. I want to have that kind of love. What do you feel when you see Drake and his Jewish mother embracing? What goes through your head when you see Rashida Jones and her family and her black Jewish family, mixed family? What goes through your heart when you see singer-songwriter Lenny Kravitz embracing his Jewish father? Well, if your name is Debbie Wasserman Schultz, and if you're president of the Democratic National Committee, I guess you think that's ugly. I guess you think they're disgusting. Because she says, just last month, we have the problem of intermarriage, talking to a group of Jews. So it's not even just Israel anymore. The conversation is long since gone beyond these borders and boundaries. You get it? So, of course, the difference is that, so Debbie Wasserman Schultz, what does she say? When she looks at photographs of Chelsea Clinton and her Jewish husband, does she disgusted by that? Is that a problem you see there? When you see a photograph of these two young men loving each other, is that ugly to you, Debbie Wasserman Schultz? So when you see people uploading these photographs, proud of themselves and their partners of choice, is that the next Holocaust for you, Debbie Wasserman Schultz? Disgusting that an American politician would speak this way. But at least she has the sense to walk back her comments. When this came out, that in this small group of people she had said these things, we have the problem of intermarriage, she at least had the sense to walk it back. No, I didn't mean that. It wasn't my intention. That wasn't what I wanted to say. Because she knows that in this context, in the United States of America, if you say stuff like that, this is what you look like. So she at least had walked it back. But in Israel, there's no sense of shame around it. You say it and you're proud of it and you announce it. So I'm going to show you how this is actually not even a new phenomenon. It's been going on for decades already. Okay? We're going to go back in time, the black and white era. This is actually pre-Israel. This is during the British Mandate of Palestine. Between World War I until just after World War II, the British were the colonial power in the land. And at any given time in the 1930s or 40s, you had about 130,000 British soldiers in Palestine, give or take. So, while the British are in the country and they're doing their maneuvers and they're standing at attention and they're aiming their rifles and they're occasionally taking breaks, and sometimes when they're off duty, they go into cafes or they go into bars or they go to dance clubs or they go to the beach, right? And on some of these occasions, when they're out in public, off duty, what could be more natural in the world? You're walking along the beach and you see an attractive woman and you say hi and you start to flirt, and some of these would turn into relationships in and of themselves. And so this woman actually is the sister of the former president of Israel. This happened to her too. She was, she met a man who was a British officer, and they fell in love and decided to spend their lives together. And this happened, but or almost every single time, these people eventually left the country because they were under so much social pressure. They were essentially excommunicated by the community. It wasn't everyone, but it was a large group, and there wasn't any pushback, really. So most of these couples, these so-called mixed-race couples, ended up, going and raising their families in other parts of the world. However, while this is happening, the Jewish settlement enterprise in Palestine is actually operating clubs and training a whole squad of women to actually be geisha girls of a sort. You have these women who it's their job to take these British soldiers out on their days off, to show them around the country, to take them on trips so they could see the sights, so they could become impressed with the Jewish settlement enterprise. Again, the idea to flirt with them in their subtle way and use their femininity to convince these British soldiers, these non-Jewish British soldiers, to embrace political Zionism. Okay? And while this is happening, again, it's the same sick script where on one hand, you have this promotion of the idea of the sexual availability of Jewish Israeli women to entice people to support Zionism, and at the same time, turning those women who actually have relationships with non-Jews into like public enemy number one. So the rabbinate at that time, the chief rabbis of that time in Mandate Palestine, they got together and they put together a committee to protect the honor of the Jewish woman or something like this. And these groups would go out, and again, the same thing, it's just like the Lahava of yesteryear. They would harass and harangue these women and threaten them, and they would beat them, and sometimes they would murder them. Okay, you had these groups, these splinter groups. They called themselves the Sons of Phineas. They would go out and they would beat and they would sometimes murder these women, and nothing ever came of it. These people who did this were never brought to trial. And that's for people who had relationships with British soldiers. If a Jewish woman was suspected of dating an Arab man, they would actually capture her, kidnap her, turn her upside down, and pour hot peppers into her vagina. Yeah. So as I said, these groups, they call themselves the Sons of Phineas. Okay? Now, B'nai Pinchas, who is Phineas? What's this a reference to? I don't expect you to necessarily know this. It's a reference to the Bible, to the Torah. And in the Bible, the story of Phineas, anyone can see it. Just turn to the book of Numbers, chapter 25. And you'll read about it. Again, I'm just going to summarize to bring you up to speed. Here are some classical renditions of the story of Phineas from antiquity. And you have, according to the biblical narrative, this man Phineas was an Israelite priest. And he was so incensed, he was so disgusted and angered upon learning that there were Jews or Israelites and non-Israelites who were having consensual relationships. He was so angered by this that he actually took his spear and he ran up on one of these couples, a young Israelite man and a Midianite woman, and he actually shish kebabbed them. He actually plunged the spear right into their intertwined genitals as they were in the act of making love. As they were copulating, he mutilated them and murdered them. And he's actually portrayed as the hero of this story. Okay, so this story of Phineas, then his name is brought into the 20th century and now the 21st century as like someone to aspire to be. Just this summer, Aryeh King, counselor for the city of Jerusalem, responsible for security in the city of Jerusalem. He tells a crowd of Jewish youth, the Rebbe, the rabbi, who is here with us, expects us to commit acts of Phineas. In other words, go out and do what he did. Go out and mutilate and murder. And the very next day, a group of young Israeli Jews went out. They kidnapped this young Palestinian man outside his parents' home. This is Mohammed Abu Khder. They kidnapped him. They dragged him into a forest. They beat him. They poured gasoline down his throat. And they burnt him to death from the inside out. When the police caught up to them and interrogated them and asked them, "Why did you do this?" they said, "We were inspired by the story of Phineas." Now, I have a question for you. Why do I remain, to this day, the only journalist who has reported that in English? The only journalist who has reported that the murders of Mohammed Abu Khder speak of Phineas as the reason why they did it. And why am I the only English language journalist to report that that city councilor in charge of security for the city of Jerusalem incited that violence by calling on young Israeli Jews to commit acts of Phineas the day before it happened? Where is the mainstream media? So what followed this past summer, I don't need to tell you. You know what went on. There's people who were actually there who can speak in much more detail about that, but just the barest of outlines. In Gaza, over 2,000 people killed, over half of them civilians. So many dead, in fact, that bodies were being put in fruit and vegetable coolers and freezers because there was nowhere else to keep them. The morgues were full, and babies and children had to be put in ice cream freezers to hold their bodies. While this is going on, what do we see on the Israeli side? You go on Facebook, and you see Israelis changing their names on Facebook. This pattern. No longer Liat Ishai, but Liat Ishai Mavet LaAravim. Liat Ishai, death to the Arabs. Instead of my name being Joseph Yehuda, my name is Joseph Yehuda, death to the Arabs. So I go over to Twitter and I do a search for the word Aravim, which is Arabs in Hebrew, and this is what I see. Just overflowing with this. Stinking Arabs, may you die. Kill them already, Arabs are whores. From the bottom of my heart, I wish for Arabs to be torched. May you be paralyzed and die with great suffering. Now, clearly there's in every society people who are full of hate, but I would have expected this to come perhaps from testosterone-y jocks, right? But when I clicked on their Twitter profiles and I found out who were saying these things, it was actually young women. Maybe like 13, 14, 15 years old were the ones tweeting this out. And that kind of shocked me. Now, of course, there are Jewish Israelis who are protesting this. Okay? In front of the American embassy here in Tel Aviv. Protests that went on in front of army bases and air force bases in Israel. Protests on the streets, people going into the intersections with these signs, and again, translated this, the occupation kills us all. So there are Jewish Israelis who are protesting this. But what is the response that they receive from those up on high? And here we have, again, the great white hope of the liberal Zionist, Tzipi Livni, at that point, the justice or injustice minister, however you see fit to call her, in the Netanyahu government. And she writes, I guess she goes on vacation during the war. So during the war, she's on vacation in Greece, and she posts on her Facebook profile, "I saw this horrible poster. It says Free Palestine. I managed to tear part of the poster." And she uploads a photograph of herself on vacation ripping up this poster. So what's the message? This is the woman who is supposed to stand for law and order. That's her job. And yet, what message is she sending? She's saying, if you see someone protesting the war, rip down that sign. rip down that poster, rip down that smile off their faces. And so this is what happens. People go out into the street to protest, and for the Palestinian citizens of Israel who protested, I mean, the police just went all in, started beating people willy-nilly, arresting over 1,000 for weeks and months, holding them. But for the Jewish Israeli population who have a little bit more privileges, so there it wasn't the police who perpetrated the violence, it was those same right-wing thugs that patrol those city streets, the same Lehava group and their allies, again, here you see with the Lehava logo, coming into the streets and just straight up attacking these. So you have the anti-war protesters, then you have the pro-war counter-protesters coming out, hearing that there's leftists on the streets protesting against the war, they come out and they start beating them. And the police are there, and the police don't do anything about it. So you go onto Facebook again, and you see police officers writing on their personal profiles the same racist garbage. Your kids are terrorists like you. Die, every one of you stinking Arabs, this police officer writes. And this officer, may another 1,000,000 Arab children die, amen. With total impunity. It's not like they lose their job the next day or something. It's just like goes on. This is like standard operating procedure. So if these are the officers who are supposed to enforce the law, then we can't expect to receive any kind of protection. So people do go out in the street to protest, and when they do, they get their heads kicked in. This guy was beaten at an anti-war protest in Haifa. As he's being evacuated in the ambulance, people are running after the ambulance and starting to trying to open the ambulance door to beat him some more. This is the deputy mayor of Haifa. He came to this anti-war protest, and then these thugs came and they beat him, and he says that he saw police standing right there, they witnessed the entire thing, and they didn't do anything to interfere. Okay, this is the deputy mayor. So this is the reality. We've come to the point where Palestinian people pretty much aren't going to downtown Jerusalem anymore and other areas of the country that are Jewish majority, because they know if they do, they're going to get their heads kicked in, so they don't even bother. So in this way, these right-wing thugs are ethnically cleansing downtown Jerusalem and other areas of the country, slowly but steadily. And again, we know the results of the war. You don't need me to tell you over 500 children killed. Each one is not just a number. They have a name, they have a family, they have friends, they are a life unto themselves. But what's happening on the Israeli side? At the end of the war, you have soldiers receiving souvenirs from their army units, which are like composite photographs. On one side, you see the neighborhood in Gaza before the war, and on the other side, the same neighborhood afterwards, destroyed. This is like their war trophy. Or here, people who printed up T-shirts, deployed, destroyed, enjoyed. Gaza 2014.